The young Greek, Michaelis, who ran the coffee joint beside the ash heaps, was the principal witness at the inquest. He had slept through the heat until 5, when he strolled over to the garage and found George Wilson sick in his office, really sick, pale as his own pale shirt, and shaking all over. Michaelis advised him to go to bed, but Wilson refused, saying that it'd miss a lot of business if he did. While his neighbor was trying to persuade him, a violent racket broke out overhead. "I've got my wife locked up in there," explained Wilson calmly. "She's going to stay there till the day after tomorrow, and then we're going to move away." Michaelis was astonished. They had been neighbors for 4 years, and Wilson had never seemed faintly capable of such a statement. Generally, he was one of those worn-out men. When he wasn't working, he sat on a chair in the doorway and stared at the people in the cars that passed along the road. When anyone spoke to him, he invariably laughed in an agreeable, colorless way. He and his wife's man, and not his own. So naturally, Michaelis tried to find out what had happened, but Wilson wouldn't say a word. Instead, he began to throw curious, suspicious glances at his visitor and asked him what he'd been doing at certain times on certain days. Just as the latter was getting uneasy, some workmen came past the door bound for his restaurant, and Michaelis took the opportunity to get away, intending to come back later, but he didn't. He supposed he forgot to, that's all. When he came outside again a little after 7, he was reminded of the conversation because he heard Mrs. Wilson's voice loud and scolding downstairs in the garage. "Beat me," he heard her cry. "Throw me down and beat me, you dirty little coward." A moment later, she rushed into the dusk, waving her hands and shouting. Before he could move from his door, the business was over. The death car, as the newspapers called it, didn't stop. It came out of the gathering darkness, wavered tragically for a moment, and then disappeared around the next bend. Michaelis wasn't even sure of its color. He told the first policeman that it was light green. The other car, the one going toward New York, came to rest 100 yards beyond, and its driver hurried back to where Myrtle Wilson, her life violently extinguished, knelt in the road and mingled her thick, dark blood in the dust. Michaelis and this man reached her first, but when they had torn open his sweatshirt, still damp with perspiration, they saw that her left breast was swinging loose like a flap, and there was no need to listen for the heart beneath. The mouth was wide open and ripped at the corners as though she had choked in a little, giving up the tremendous vitality she had stored so long. We saw the 3 or 4 automobiles in the crowd when we were all some distance away. "Wreck," said Tom. "That's good. Wilson will have a little business at last." He slowed down, but still without any intention of stopping, until, as we came nearer, the hushed, intent faces of the people of the garage door made him automatically put on the brakes. "We'll take a look," he said doubtfully. "Just a look." I became aware now of a hollow wailing sound which issued incessantly from the garage, a sound which, as we got out of the coupe and walked toward the door, resolved itself into the words, "Oh my God," uttered over and over in a gasping moan. "There was some bad trouble here," said Tom excitedly. He reached up on tiptoes and peered over a circle of heads into the garage, which was lit only by a yellow light in a swinging wire basket overhead. Then he made a harsh sound in his throat, and with a violent thrusting movement of his powerful arms, pushed his way through. The circle closed up again with a running murmur of expostulation. It was a minute before I could see anything at all. Then new arrivals disarranged the line, and Jordan and I were pushed suddenly inside. Myrtle Wilson's body, wrapped in a blanket and then in another blanket as though she suffered from a chill in the hot night, lay on a work table by the wall, and Tom, with his back to us, was bending over it, motionless. Next to him stood a motorcycle policeman, taking down names with much sweat and correction in a little book. At first I couldn't find the source of the high, groaning words that echoed clamorously through the bare garage. Then I saw Wilson, standing on the raised threshold of his office, swaying back and forth and holding to the doorposts with both hands. Some man was talking to him in a low voice and attempting from time to time to lay a hand on his shoulder, but Wilson neither heard nor saw. His eyes would droop slowly from the swinging light to the laden table by the wall, and then jerk back to the light again, and he gave out an incessantly high, horrible call. "Oh my God! Oh my God! Oh God! Oh my God!" Presently Tom lifted his head with a jerk, and after staring around the garage with glazed eyes, addressed a mumbled, incoherent remark to the policeman. The policeman was saying, "Oh, no," corrected the man. "Mavro." "Listen to me," muttered Tom fiercely, said the policeman. Oh. He looked up at Tom's broad hand, fell sharply on his shoulder. What do you want, fella? What happened? That's what I want to know. Auto hit her. Instantly killed. Instantly killed, repeated Tom, staring. She ran out in the road, son of a bitch, wouldn't stop his car. There was 2 cars, said Mike Hallis. One coming, one going, see? Going where? Asked the policeman keenly. One going each way. Well, His hand rose toward the blankets, but stopped halfway and fell to his side. She ran out there, and the one coming from New York knocked round right into her, going 30 or 40 miles an hour. What's the name of this place here? Demanded the officer. Hasn't got any. A pale, well-dressed Negro stepped near. It was a yellow car, he said. Big yellow car, new. See the accident? Asked the policeman. No, but the car passed me down the road, going faster than 40, going 50, 60. Come on. Let's have your name. Look out now. I want to get his name. Some words of his conversation must have reached Wilson, swaying in his office door, for suddenly a new theme found voice among his gasping cries. You don't have to tell me what kind of car it was. I know what kind of car it was. Watching Tom, I saw the wad of muscle back of his shoulder tighten under his coat. He walked quickly over to Wilson and, standing in front of him, seized him firmly by the upper arms. You've got to pull yourself together, he said with sudden stiffness. Wilson's eyes fell upon Tom. He stared up on his tiptoes and then would have collapsed to his knees had not Tom held him upright. Listen, said Tom, shaking a little. I just got here a minute ago from New York. I was bringing you that coupe we've been talking about. That yellow car I was driving this afternoon wasn't mine. Do you hear? I haven't seen it at all this afternoon. Only the Negro and I were near enough to hear what he said, but the policeman caught something in the tone and looked over with truculent eyes. What's all that? He demanded. I'm a friend of his. Tom turned his head, but kept his hands firm on Wilson's body. He says he knows the car that did it. It was a yellow car. Some dim impulse moved the policeman to look suspiciously at Tom. And what color's your car? It's a blue car, a coupe. We've come straight from New York, I said. Someone who had been driving a little behind us confirmed this, and the policeman turned away. Now, if you'll let me have that name again correct. Picking up Wilson like a doll. Tom carried him into the office, set him into a chair, and came back. If somebody'll come back here and sit with him, he snapped authoritatively. He watched while the 2 men standing closest glanced at each other and went unwillingly into the room. Then Tom shut the door on them and came down the single step, his eyes avoiding the table. As he passed close to me, he whispered, "Let's get out." Self-consciously, with his authoritative arms breaking the way, he pushed through the still-gathering crowd, passing a hurried doctor, case in hand, who had been sent in for a wild hope half an hour ago. Tom drove slowly until we were beyond the bend, then his foot came down hard and the coupe raced along the night. In a little while I heard a low, husky sob and saw the tears were overflowing down his face. The goddamn coward, he whimpered. He didn't even stop his car. The Buchanan's house floated suddenly toward us through the dark, rustling trees. Tom stepped down the porch and looked up at the second floor, where 2 windows bloomed with the hot light among the vines. Daisy's home, he said. As if we got out of the car, he glanced at me and frowned slightly. I ought to have dropped you in West Egg, Nick. There's nothing we can do tonight. A change had come over him, and he spoke gravely and with decision. As we walked across the moonlit gravel to the porch, he disposed of the situation in a few brisk phrases. I'll telephone for a taxi to take you home, and while you're waiting, you and Jordan better go in the kitchen and have them make you some supper if you want any. He opened the door. Come in. No thanks, but I'd be glad if you'd ordered me the taxi. I'll wait outside. Jordan put her hand on my arm. Won't you come in, Nick? No, thanks. I was feeling a little sick and I wanted to be alone, but Jordan lingered for a moment more. It's only 9:30, she said. I'd be damned if I'd go in. I'd had enough of all of them for one day, and suddenly that included Jordan too. She must have seen something of this in my expression, and she turned abruptly away and ran up the porch steps to the house. I sat down for a few minutes with my head in my hands until I heard the phone taken up inside the butler's voice calling a taxi. Then I walked slowly down the drive away from the house, intended to wait by the gate. I hadn't gone 20 yards when I heard my name, and Gatsby stepped up from behind 2 bushes in the path. I must have felt pretty weird by the time, because I could think of nothing except the luminosity of his pink suit under the moon. What are you doing? I inquired. Just standing here, old sport. Somehow that seemed a despicable occupation. For all I knew, he was going to rob the house in a moment. I wouldn't have been surprised to see sinister faces, the faces of Wolfsheim's people, behind him in the dark shrubbery. "Did you see any trouble on the road?" he asked for a minute. "Yes." He hesitated. "Was she killed?" "Yes." "I thought so. I told Daisy I thought so. It's better that the shock should come all at once. She stood it pretty well." He spoke as if Daisy's reaction was the only thing that mattered. "I got to West Egg by the side road," he went on, "and left the car in my garage. I don't think anybody saw us, but of course, I can't be sure." I disliked him so much by this time that I didn't find it necessary to tell him he was wrong. "Who was the woman?" he inquired. "Her name was Wilson. Her husband owns the garage. How the devil did it happen?" "Well, I tried to swing the wheel," he broke off, and suddenly I guessed the truth. "Was Daisy driving?" "Yes," he said after a moment, "but of course I'll say I was. You see, when we left New York, she was very nervous, and she thought it would steady her to drive, and this woman rushed out at us just as we were passing. A car came the other way. It all happened in a minute, and it seemed to me that she wanted to speak to us, though we were somebody she knew. Well, first, Daisy turned away from the woman toward the other car, then she lost her nerve and turned back. The second my hand reached the wheel, I felt a shock. It must have killed her instantly. It ripped her open." "Don't tell me, old sport," he winced. "Anyhow, Daisy stepped on it. I tried to make her stop, but she couldn't. I pulled on the emergency brake, then she fell over in my lap, and I drove on. She'll be all right tomorrow," he said presently. "I'm just going to wait here and see if he tries to bother her about that unpleasantness this afternoon. She's locked herself into the room, and if he tries any brutality, he's going to turn the light out and on again." "He won't touch her," I said. "He's not thinking about her." "I don't trust him, old sport." "How long are you going to wait?" "All night, if necessary, anyhow, till they all go to bed." A new point of view occurred to me. Suppose Tom found out that Daisy had been driving. He might think he saw a connection in it. He might think of anything. I looked at the house. There were 2 or 3 bright windows downstairs and the pink glow from Daisy's room on the second floor. "You wait here," I said. "I'll see if there's any sign of commotion." I walked back along the border of the lawn, traversed the gravel softly, and tiptoed up the veranda steps. The drawing room curtains were open, and I saw the room was empty. Crossing the porch where we dined that June night 3 months before, I came to a small rectangle of the light, which I guessed was the pantry window. The blind was drawn, but I found a rift at it still. Daisy and then Tom were sitting opposite each other at the kitchen table with a plate of cold fried chicken between them and 2 bottles of ale. He was talking intently across the table at her, and in his earnestness his hand had fallen upon the covered her own. Once in a while she looked up at him and nodded in agreement. They weren't happy, and neither of them had touched the chicken or ale, and yet they weren't unhappy either. There was an unmistakable air of natural intimacy about the picture, and anybody would have said that they were conspiring together. As I tiptoed from the porch, I heard my taxi feeling its way along the dark road out toward the house. Gatsby was waiting where I had left him in the drive. "Is it all quiet up there?" he asked anxiously. "Yes, it's all quiet," I hesitated, "but you'd better come home and get some sleep." He shook his head. "I want to wait here till Daisy goes to bed. Good night, old sport." He put his hand in his coat pockets and turned back eagerly to his scrutiny of the house, as though my presence marred the sacredness of the vigil. So I walked away and left him standing there in the moonlight, watching over nothing. Chapter 8. I couldn't sleep at all. A foghorn was groaning incessantly on the sound, and I tossed half-sick between grotesque reality and savage, frightening dreams. Toward dawn, I heard a taxi go up to Gadsby's drive, and immediately I jumped out of the bed and began to dress. I felt that I had something to tell him, something to warn him about, and morning would be too late. Crossing his lawn, I saw that his front door was still open, and he was leaning against a table in the hall, heavy with dejection or sleep. "Nothing happened," he said wanly. "I waited for an hour, until about 4 o'clock, and she came to the window and stood there for a minute and then turned out the light." His house had never seemed so enormous to me as it did that night when we hunted through the great rooms for cigarettes. We pushed aside curtains that were like pavilions and felt over innumerable feet of dark wall for electric light switches. Once I tumbled with a sort of splash upon the keys of a ghostly piano. There was an inexplicable amount of dust everywhere, and the rooms were musty, as though they hadn't been aired for many days. I found the humidor of an unfamiliar table with 2 stale dry cigarettes inside. Throwing open the French windows of the drawing room, we sat smoking out into the darkness. "You ought to go away," I said. "It's pretty certain they'll trace your car." "Go away now, old sport." go to Atlantic City for a week or up to Montreal, he wouldn't consider it. He couldn't possibly leave Daisy until he knew what she was going to do. He was clutching at some last hope, and I couldn't bear to shake him free. It was this night that he told me the strange story of his youth with Dan Cody. He told it to me because Jay Gatsby had broken up like glass against Tom's hard malice, and the long secret extravaganza was played out. I think that he would have acknowledged anything anyhow, without reserve, but he wanted to talk about Daisy. She was the first nice girl he had ever known. In various unrevealed capacities, she had come in contact with such people, but always with indiscernible barbed wire between. He found her excitingly desirable. He went to her house at first with other officers from Camp Taylor, then alone. It amazed him. He had never been in such a beautiful house before. But what gave it an air of breathless intensity was that Daisy lived there. It was a casual thing to her, as this tent out at the camp was to him. There was a ripe mystery about it, a hint of bedrooms upstairs more beautiful and cool than other bedrooms, of gay and radiant activities taking place through its corridors, and of romances that were not musty and laid away already in lavender, but fresh and breathing and redolent of this year's shining motor cars and dances, whose flowers were scarcely withered. It excited him, too, that the many men had already loved Daisy. It increased her value in his eyes. He felt their presence all about the house, pervading the air that with shades and echoes of still vibrant emotions. But he knew that he was in Daisy's house by a colossal accident. However glorious might be his future as Jay Gatsby, he was at present a penniless young man without a past, and at any moment the invisible cloak of his uniform might slip from his shoulders. So he made the most of his time. He took what he could get, ravenously and unscrupulously. Eventually he took Daisy one still October night, took her because he had no real right to touch her hand. He might have despised himself, for he had recently taken her under false pretenses. I don't mean that he had traded on his phantom millions, but he had deliberately given Daisy a sense of security. He let her believe that he was a person from much the same strata as herself, that he was fully able to take care of her. As a matter of fact, he had no such facilities. He had no comfortable family standing behind him. He was liable at the whim of an impersonal government to be blown anywhere about the world. But he didn't despise himself, and it didn't turn out that he had imagined. He had intended probably to take what he could get and go. But now he found that he had committed himself to the following of a grail. He knew that Daisy was extraordinary, but he didn't realize just how extraordinary a nice girl could be. She vanished into her house, into her rich, full life, leaving Gatsby nothing. He felt her married to her, that was all. When they met again 2 days later, it was Gatsby who was breathless, who was now somehow betrayed. Her porch was bright with the bought luxury of starshine. The wicker of the settee squeaked fashionably as she turned toward him and kissed her curious and lovely mouth. She had caught a cold, and it made her voice huskier and more charming than ever, and Gatsby was overwhelmingly aware of the youth and mystery that wealth imprisons and preserves, of the freshness of many clothes, and of Daisy gleaming like silver, safe and proud above the hot struggles of the poor. I can't describe to you how surprised I was to find out I loved her old sport. I even hoped for a while that she'd throw me over, but she didn't, because she was in love with me too. She thought I knew a lot because I knew different things from her. Well, there I was, way off my ambitions, getting deeper in love every minute, and all of a sudden I didn't care. What was the use of doing great things if I had better time telling her what I was going to do? On the last afternoon before she went abroad, he sat with Daisy in his arms for a long, silent time. It was a cold fall day with fire in the room, and her cheeks flushed. Now and then she moved, and he changed his arm a little, and once he kissed her dark, shining hair. The afternoon had made them tranquil for a while, as if they gave a deep memory for a long parting the next day promised. They had never been closer in their month of love, nor communicated more profoundly one with another than when she brushed silent lips against his coat's shoulder, or when she touched the end of her finger gently as though she were asleep. He did extraordinarily well in the war. He was a captain before he went to the front, and following the Argonne battles, he got his majesty and commanded the divisional machine guns. After the armistice, he tried frantically to get home, but some complication or misunderstanding sent him to Oxford instead. He was worried now, There was a quality of nervous despair in Daisy's letters. She didn't see why he couldn't come. She was feeling the pressure of the world outside, and she wanted to see him and feel his presence behind her, and reassured that she was doing the right thing after all. For Daisy was young, and her artificial world was redolent of orchids and pleasant, cheerful snobbery and orchestras which set the rhythm of the year, summing up the sadness and suggestiveness of life in new tunes. All night the saxophones wailed the hopeless comment of the Beale Street Blues, while 100 pairs of golden and slippers shuffled the shining dust at the gray tea hour. There were always rooms that throbbed incessantly with this low, sweet fever, while fresh faces drifted here and there like rose petals blown by the sad horns around the floor. Through the twilight universe, Daisy began to move again with the season. Suddenly she was again keeping half a dozen dates a day with half a dozen men, and drowsing asleep at the dawn with the beads of the chiffon and an evening dress tangled among dying orchids on the floor beside her. And all the time, somehow, something within her was crying for a decision. She wanted her life shaped now, immediately. And the decision must be made by some force of love, of money, of unquestionable practicality. That was close at hand. That force took shape in the middle of spring with the arrival of Tom Buchanan. There was a wholesome bulkiness about this person and his position, and Daisy was flattered. Doubtless there was certain struggle and a certain relief. The letter reached Gatsby while he was still at Oxford. It was dawn now on a long island when he went about opening the rest of the windows downstairs, filling the house with gray-turning, gold-turning light. The shadow of a tree fell abruptly across the dew, and the ghostly birds began to sing among the blue leaves. There was a slow, pleasant movement in the air, scarcely a wind, promising a cool, lovely day. I don't think she ever loved him. Gatsby turned around from a window and looked at me challengingly. You must remember, old sport, she was very excited this afternoon. He told her those things in a way that frightened her. It made it look as if I was some kind of a cheap sharper. And the result was she hardly knew what she was saying. He sat down gloomily. Of course, she might have loved him for just a minute when they first were married, and loved me even more then, don't you see? Suddenly he came out with a curious remark. In any case, he said, it was just personal. What could you make of that, except to suspect some intensity in his conception of the affair that couldn't be measured? He came back from France when Tom and Daisy were still on their wedding trip, and made a miserable but irresistible journey to Louisville on the last of his army pay. He stayed there a week, walking the streets where their footsteps had clicked together through the November night and revisiting the out-of-the-way places to which he had driven in her white car. Just as Daisy's house had always seemed to him more mysterious and gay than other houses, so his idea of the city itself, even though she had gone from it, was pervaded with a melancholy beauty. He left feeling that if he had searched harder, he might have found her, that he was leaving her behind. The day coach, he was penniless now, was hot. He went out the open vestibule and sat down on a folding chair, and the station slid away and the backs of unfamiliar buildings moved by. Then out into the Springs fields, where a yellow trolley raced there for a minute with people in it who might once have been the pale magic of her face along the casual street. The track curved, and now it was going away from the sun, which as it sank lower seemed to spread itself in benediction over the vanishing city where she was drawn her breath. He reached out his hand desperately, as if to snatch only a wisp of air, to save a fragment of the spot that she had made lovely for him. But it was all going by too fast now for his blurred eyes, and he knew that he had lost that part of her, the freshest and the best forever. It was 9 o'clock when he finished breakfast and went out to the porch. The night had made a sharp difference in the weather, and there was an autumn flavor in the air. The gardener, the last one of Gatsby's former servants, came to the foot of the steps. I'm going to drain the pool today, Mr. Gatsby. Leaves will start falling pretty soon, and there's always trouble with the pipes. Don't do it today, Gatsby answered. He turned to me apologetically. You know, old sport, I never used the pool all summer. I looked at my watch and stood up. 12 minutes to my train. I didn't want to go to the city. I wasn't worth a decent stroke of work, but it was more than that. I didn't want to leave Gatsby. I missed that train and then another before I could get myself away. I'll call you up, I said finally. Do, old sport. I'll call you about noon. We walked slowly down the steps. I suppose Daisy'll call too. He looked at me anxiously as if he hoped I'd corroborate this. I suppose so. Well, goodbye. We shook hands and I started away. Just before I reached the hedge, I remembered something and turned around. "They're a rotten crowd," I shouted across the lawn. "You're worth a whole damn bunch put together." I've always been glad I said that. It was the only compliment I ever gave him because I disapproved of him from beginning to end. First he nodded politely, and then his face broke into that radiant and understanding smile as if we'd been in ecstatic cahoots on that fact all the time. His gorgeous pink rag of a suit made a bright spot of color against the white steps, and I thought of the night when I first came to his ancestral house 3 months before. The lawn and drive had been crowded with the faces of those who guessed at his corruption, and he had stood on those steps concealing his incorruptible dream as we waved them goodbye. I thanked him for his hospitality. We were always thanking him for that, I and the others. "Goodbye," I called. "I enjoyed breakfast, Gatsby." Up in the city, I tried for a while to list the quotations on an interminable amount of stock when I fell asleep by my swivel chair. Just before noon, the phone woke me, and I started up with the sweat breaking out on my forehead. It was Jordan Baker. She often called me up at this hour because the uncertainty of her own movements between hotels and clubs and private houses made her hard to find in any other way. Usually, her voice came over the wire as something fresh and cool, as if a divot from a green golf links had come sailing in at the office window, but this morning it seemed harsh and dry. "I've left Daisy's house," she said. "I'm at Hempstead, and I'm going down to Southampton this afternoon." Probably it had been tactful to leave Daisy's house, but the act annoyed me, and her next remark made me rigid. "You weren't so nice to me last night. How could it have mattered then?" Silence for a moment, then. "However, I want to see you. I want to see you too. Suppose I don't go to Southampton. I come into town this afternoon." "No, I don't think this afternoon." "Very well. It's impossible this afternoon, Various." We talked like that for a while, and then abruptly we weren't talking any longer. I don't know which of us hung up with a sharp click, but I know I didn't care. I couldn't have talked to her across a tea table that day if I never talked to her again in this world. I called Gadsby's house a few minutes later, but the line was busy. I tried 4 times. Finally, an exasperated central told me that the wires were being kept open for long distance from Detroit. Taking out my timetable, I drew a small circle around the 3:50 train. Then I leaned back in my chair and tried to think. It was just noon. When I passed the ash heaps on the train that morning, I had crossed deliberately to the other side of the car. I suppose there'd be a curious crowd there all day with the little boys searching for dark spots in the dust, and some garrulous man telling over and over what had happened, until it became less and less real even to him, and he could tell it no longer, and Myrtle Wilson's tragic achievement was forgotten. Now I want to go back a little and tell what happened in the garage before we left the night before. They had difficulty in locating the sister Catherine. She must have broken her rule against drinking that night, for when she arrived she was stupid with liquor and unable to understand what the ambulance had already gone to Flushing. When they convinced her of this, she immediately fainted, as if that were the intolerable part of the affair. Someone kind of curious took her into his car and drove her in the wake of his sister's body. Until long after midnight, a changing crowd lapped up against the front of the garage, while George Wilson rocked himself back and forth on the couch inside. For a while, the door of the office was open, and everyone who came into the garage glanced irresistibly through it. Finally, someone said it was a shame and closed the door. Michaelis and several other men were with him, 4 or 5 men, later 2 or 3. Still later, Michaelis had to ask the last stranger to wait there 15 minutes longer while he went back to his own place and made a pot of coffee. After that, he stayed there alone with Wilson until dawn. About 3 o'clock, the quality of Wilson's incoherent muttering changed. He grew quieter and began to talk about the yellow car. He announced that he had a way of finding out whom the yellow car belonged to, and then he blurted out that a couple of months ago his wife had come from the city with her face bruised and her nose swollen. But when he heard himself say this, he flinched and began to cry, "Oh, my God!" Again in his groaning voice, Michaelis made a clumsy attempt to distract him. "How long have you been married, George? Come on there. Try and sit still a minute and answer my question. How long have you been married? 12 years. Ever had any children? Come on, George, sit still. I asked you a question. Do you have any children?" The hard brown beetles kept thudding against the dull light, and whenever Michaelis heard a car go tearing along the road outside, it sounded to him like the car that didn't stop a few hours before. He didn't like to go into the garage because the workbench was stained where the body had been lying, so he moved uncomfortably around the office. He knew every object in it before morning, and from time to time he sat down beside Wilson, trying to keep him more quiet. Have you got a church you go to sometimes, George? Maybe even if you haven't been there for a long time? Maybe I could call up the church and get a priest to come over and talk to you. See? Don't belong to any. You ought to have a church, George, for times like this. You must have gone to church once. Didn't you get married in a church? Listen, George, listen to me. Didn't you get married in a church? That was a long time ago. The effort of answering broke the rhythm of his rocking. For a moment he was silent. Then the same half-knowing, half-bewildered, half-look came back into his faded eyes. Look in the drawer here, he said, pointing at his desk. Which drawer? That drawer. That one. Mike Ellis opened a door nearest his hand. There was nothing in it but a small, expensive dog leash made of leather and braided silver. It was apparently new. This? He inquired, holding it up. Wilson stared and nodded. I found it yesterday afternoon. She tried to tell me about it, but I knew it was something funny. You mean your wife bought it? She had it wrapped in tissue paper on her bureau. Mike Ellis didn't see anything odd in that, and he gave Wilson a dozen reasons why his wife might have bought a dog leash. But conceivably, Wilson had heard some of these same explanations before from Myrtle. Because he began saying, "Oh my God," again in a whisper. His comforter left several explanations in the air. Then he killed her, said Wilson. His mouth dropped open suddenly. Who did? I have a way of finding out. You're morbid, George, said his friend. This has been a strain to you, and you don't know what you're saying. You'd better try and sit quiet till morning. He murdered her. It was an accident, George. Wilson shook his head. His eyes narrowed and his mouth widened slightly with a ghost of a superior. I know, he said definitely. I'm one of these trusting fellows, and I don't think any harm to nobody. But when I get to know a thing, I know it. It was the man in that car. She ran out to speak to him, and he wouldn't stop. Mike Ellis had seen this too, but it hadn't occurred to him that there was any special significance in it. He believed that Mrs. Wilson had been running away from her husband rather than trying to stop any particular car. How could she have been like that? She's a deep one, said Wilson, as if that answered the question. He began to rock again. Mike Ellis stood twisting the leash in his hand. Maybe you got some friend I could telephone for you, George? This was a forlorn hope. He was almost sure that Wilson had no friend. There was not enough of him for his wife. He was glad a little later when he noticed a change in the room. Blue quickening by the window, and realized that dawn wasn't far off. About 5 o'clock it was blue enough outside to snap off the light. Wilson's glazed eyes turned out to the ash heaps. There, small gray clouds took on fantastic shapes and scurried here and there in the faint dawn wind. I spoke to her, he muttered. After a long silence, I told her she might fool me, but she couldn't fool God. I took her to the window. With an effort, he got up and walked to the rear window and leaned with his face pressed against it. And I said, God knows what you've been doing, everything you've been doing. You may fool me, but you can't fool God. Standing beside him, Mike Ellis saw the shock that he was looking at the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg, which had just emerged, pale and enormous, from the dissolving night. God sees everything, repeated Wilson. It's an advertisement, Mike Ellis assured him. Something made him turn away from the window and look back into the room, but Wilson stood there a long time, his face close to the window pane, nodding into the twilight. By 6 o'clock, Mike Ellis was sworn out and grateful for the sound of a car stopping outside. It was one of the watchers of the night before. He had promised to come back so he could breakfast for 3, which he and the other man ate together. Wilson was quieter now, and Mike Ellis went home to sleep. When he awoke 4 hours and hurried back to the garage, Wilson had gone. His movements, he was on foot all the time, were afterward traced to Port Roosevelt and then to Gad's Hill, where he bought a sandwich and didn't stop to eat, and a cup of coffee. He must have been tired and walked slowly, for he didn't reach Gad's Hill until noon. Thus far, there was no difficulty in accounting for his time. There were boys who had seen a man acting sort of crazy, and motorists whom he stared at oddly from the side of the road. Then for 3 hours he disappeared from view. The police, on the strength of what he said to Mike Ellis, that he had a way of finding out, supposed that he spent this time going from garage to garage thereabouts, inquiring for a yellow car. On the other hand, no garage man who had ever seen him ever came forward, and perhaps he had an easier, surer way of finding out what he wanted to know. By 2:30, he was in West Egg, where he asked someone the way to Gadsby's house. So by that time, he knew Gadsby's name. At 2 o'clock, Gadsby put on a bathing suit and left word with the butler that if anyone phoned, word was to be brought to him at the pool. He stopped at the garage for a pneumatic mattress that had amused his guests during the summer, and the chauffeur helped him pump it up. Then he gave instructions that the open car wasn't to be taken out under any circumstances, and this was strange, because the right front fender needed repair. Gadsby shouldered the mattress and started for the pool. Once he stopped and shifted it a little, and the chauffeur asked him if he needed help, but he shook his head in a moment, disappeared among the yellowing trees. No telephone message arrived, but the butler went without his sleep and waited for it until 4 o'clock, until long after that there was anyone to give it to him as if it came. I have an idea that Gadsby himself didn't believe it would come, and perhaps he no longer cared. If that was true, he must have felt that he had lost his old warm, plaid, high price for a living too long with a single dream. He must have looked up at an unfamiliar sky through frightening leaves and shivered as he found what a grotesque thing was a rosy and how raw the sunlight was upon the scarcely created grass, a new world material without being real, where poor ghosts, breathing dreams like air, drifting fortuitously about like that ashen, fantastic figure, gliding toward him through the amorphous trees. The chauffeur, he was one of Wolfsheim's protégés, heard the shots. Afterward, he could only say that he hadn't thought anything much about them. I drove from the station directly to Gadsby's house, and my rushing anxiously up the front steps was the first thing that alarmed anyone. But they knew then, I firmly believe, with scarcely a word said. 4 of us, the chauffeur, butler, gardener, and I, hurried down to the pool. There was a faint, barely perceptible movement of the water as the fresh flow from one end urged its way toward the drain at the other. With little ripples that were hardly the shadows of waves, the laden mattress moved irregularly down the pool. A small gust of wind that scarcely corrugated the surface was enough to disturb its accidental course with its accidental burden. The touch of a cluster of leaves revolved slowly, tracing like the leg of a compass a thin red circle in the water. It was after we started with Gadsby toward the house that the gardener saw Wilson's body a little way off in the grass, and the Holocaust was complete. Chapter 9. After 2 years, I remember the rest of the day and the night the next day only as an endless drill of police and photographers and newspapermen in and out of Gadsby's front door. A rope stretched across the main gate, and a policeman by it kept out the curious, but little boys soon discovered that they could enter through my yard, and there were always a few of them clustered open-mouthed about the pool. Someone with a positive manner, perhaps a detective, used the expression madman as he bent over Wilson's body that afternoon, and the adventitious authority of his voice set the key for the newspaper reports the next morning. Most of these reports were a nightmare, grotesque, circumstantial, eager, and untrue. When Mike Hellis's testimony at the inquest brought to light Wilson's suspicions of his wife, I thought the whole tale would shortly be served up in a racy pasquinade. But Catherine, who might have said anything, didn't say a word. She showed a surprising amount of character about it, too. Looked at the coroner with determined eyes under the corrected brow of hers, and swore that her sister had never seen Gadsby, that her sister was completely happy with her husband, that her sister had been into no mischief whatsoever. She convinced herself of it and cried into her handkerchief, as if the very suggestion was more than she could endure. So Wilson was reduced to a man deranged by grief in order that the case might remain the simplest form, and arrested there. But all this part of it seemed remote and unessential. I found myself on Gadsby's side, and alone. From the moment I telephoned news to the catastrophe to the West Egg Village, every surmise about him and every practical question was referred to me. At first I was surprised and confused. Then, as he lay in this house, and I didn't move or breathe or speak upon hour, it grew upon me that I was responsible because no one else was interested. Interested, I mean, with that intense personal interest to which everyone has somehow vague right at the end. I called up Daisy half an hour after we found him, called her instinctively and without hesitation, but she and Tom had gone away early that afternoon and taken baggage with them. Left no address? No. Say when they'd be back? No. Any idea where they are? How could I reach them? I don't know. Can't say. I wanted to get somebody for them. I wanted to go into the room where he lay and reassure him. "I'll get somebody for you, Gatsby. Don't worry. Just trust me and I'll get somebody for you." Meyer Wolfsheim's name wasn't in the phone book. The butler gave me his office address on Broadway and I called information. But at that time I had a number. It was long after 5 and no one answered the phone. "Will you ring again?" "I've rung 3 times. It's very important." "Sorry, I'm afraid there's no one there." I went back to the drawing room and thought for an instant that there were chance visitors. All these official people who suddenly filled it, but as they drew back the sheet and looked at Gatsby with unmoved eyes, his protest continued in my brain. "Look here, old sport. You've got somebody for you. You've got to try hard. I can't go through this alone. Someone to ask me questions." But I broke away and going downstairs, looked hastily through the unlocked parts of his desk. He'd never told me definitely that his parents were dead, but there was nothing, only the picture of Dan Cody, a token of forgotten violence staring down from the wall. Next morning I sent the butler to New York with a letter to Wolfsheim, which asked for the information and urged him to come out onto the next train. The request seemed superfluous when I wrote it. I was sure he'd start when he saw the newspapers, just as I was there for a wire from Daisy before noon, but neither a wire nor Wolfsheim arrived. No one arrived except more police and photographers and newspapermen. When the butler brought back Wolfsheim's answer, I began to have a feeling of defiance, of scornful solidarity between Gatsby and me against them all.